for a long time. Some are featured in today's discussion panel, and others are listed on as affiliates on our brand new and yet still under construction webpage. So we're so excited again to have you all here today. I have a list of thank yous that I want to go through, and then I will turn it over to Dean Marjorie Alion, who will tell you a little bit more about the process through which the Center for Community Health Equity Research was established. I want to thank the Vice Chancellor for Research's Office and the Dean for their generous support of the center and for this event. I want to thank our research assistants, Andrea Mancuso and Faith English, for all their work getting this event together, and to the anonymous donor to the School of Public Health who has contributed to funding their positions. I want to thank Patrick Freeman for his work creating our brochures and everything else that he did to help get this event off the ground. I want to thank our spectacular and invaluable community liaison, Brenda Evans, who is sitting outside, so not here for me to wave to her and say thank you. And to Fayana Richards, our postdoc, who jumped into the fray the moment that she arrived just this past January. And I want to thank all the community partners who have been engaged in this important work for a long time and who are willing to make room for more. I am honored to be working alongside you. Marjorie.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome to everybody here. As Susan said, I've had the honor of being the Dean of the School of Public Health and Health Sciences since January of 2009. And so I thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of history to really give you a sense of where we've come and where this whole concept has come from and where we are now. So I wanted to share an email that was actually from May 10th of 2010. And it was an invitation. And it says, "Dear colleagues, Dean Marjorie Alion and the School of Public Health and Health Sciences welcomes your participation in our May 19th Kickoff Forum for the Springfield Holyoke Health Alliance for Research and Engagement." SHHARE, share. So at this time, we expect 40 participants from the community and across the university. The forum will be held from 9 to 1, Campus Center. The event will include lunch, always incentivized. And then it says, and just as a reminder, the purpose of this meeting, the goal for this forum is to establish a formal mechanism by which community groups, community research associates, CRAs, and researchers come together to share information, coordinate efforts. Using the principles of community-based participatory research, CBPR, we seek to create an alliance with a shared mission to improve health in our communities. This alliance will identify key public health issues, needs, and desires in our communities in order to help build capacity for collaborations and partnerships and to create strategies for positive community change. Now let me read a shorter email sent about a month later in 2010 from Risa Silverman and Elaine Palaio, who really were two of the people who started SHARE along with several other faculty. Hi, Marjorie. Elaine and I met today to review our 2007 School of Public Health and Health Sciences goals and objectives. Below you will see a few that Elaine and I thought you would want to fall under the Dean's office, and I hope that this is laid out clearly. If not, let me know. Risa's always so helpful. And she is here today, so has contributed to the school in many ways. One of those goals was research goals and objectives. Establish a center for participatory research in health disparities and develop 2 initiatives in community participatory research by 2010. Okay, so we're talking about goals established over 10 years ago. And then it says has evolved into SHARE, S-H-H-A-R-E. I'm going to have to spell all these to distinguish. And the second was service and outreach goals and objectives. Objective 3.A.2. Commencing in spring 2007, schedule biannual meetings with community partners to identify local health needs and problems to be addressed through research studies and intervention strategies. Part of the outcome was the Office of Public Health Practice and Outreach, which we have in the School of Public Health and Health Sciences, and SHARE, S-H-H-A-R-E. So I think SHARE really played an important piece of the development of some of the things that are now coming to fruition. And it was born out of not just the efforts of Risa Silverman and Elaine Paleo, but many faculty and many community groups and people in the community. But one thing that I saw that was still missing from where we are as a School of Public Health and Health Sciences is that at my previous institution, I served as the Associate Dean for Research. In that, many schools of public health have many well-funded centers really focused on community-based research, providing resources to those communities, working with them, and also providing opportunities for students because of those. And I really saw firsthand what some of those centers can provide besides continuity. There tend to be 5-year centers. Some have been going on for more than 20 years. But a lot of these were started in the 1990s and early 2000s, and this School of Public Health and Health Sciences was not really in a position at that time to had enough faculty that we could compete for some of those, and that has really all changed. So I think a lot of what we can contribute now compared to 2007 or 2004, it is so different in terms of faculty, students, and many others, and community partners and relationships that have grown stronger and stronger. So what I thought that this share, see now you're going to have to switch, CCHER, really could focus on research. And I think the faculty, the community, we've already been doing research together, but this formalizes it a little bit more. And it focused on things that were really a commitment of our faculty and our students in health equity, and it really addresses a lot of public health challenges. So when we developed the proposal for SHARE in summer of 2016, how the process here is that you get input from other entities on campus, other deans write letters of support, and they were all so highly supportive, the other deans on campus. And so that proposal was submitted in 2016. But one other great piece is where we are now compared to 2007 is that the university also provided some support. And that support came in Susan Shaw, a position for the director, before it was even approved, interim approval for a center, and we're really excited that she's come. That was requested and approved in 2015, and then in the next year, Jin Kim, who was started in September 2017, and now we have 2 additional people, again, through university support and school support, and are really excited to keep growing this in faculty, keep growing this in students, and we will have, as I mentioned, 2 new people, Erin Denise Martinez and Luis Arturo Valdez, and that will be in September of 2018. So those faculty, in addition to the people we have, give us a much better starting point to have what we had as goals in 2007. It was actually before I came, but also to just go forward in the right way, in a sustained way. So SHARE, CCHER, it's really a center that's going to engage faculty across the School of Public Health and Health Sciences, across the university, across universities, and across organizations and communities, non-academic, academic. It's really unlimited. And the other part is it's communities that are local, you'll hear local, and also national and global. We already do this, but it's wonderful to have an entity with a mission and a vision, and I can read you that mission and vision because it is so close to what we've been trying to do for quite a long time. The Center for Community Health Equity Research seeks to promote health equity by eliminating disparities among underserved and disadvantaged populations. SHARE supports the multidisciplinary research investigating the social production of health disparities and the relationship between individual, social, and environmental structures that impact quality of life and population health. The purpose, SHARE seeks to address the gap between academic research and practice by leveraging rigorous studies to drive public health policies. SHARE builds collective resilience by forging partnerships, both locally and globally, through participatory research with clinical and community-based organizations. So in some ways, I see this as just something that the school has been doing for a long time, and it will continue to do. And I will tell you, for those who don't think about this on a daily basis, if there's one thing I'm going to encourage you to remember from some of my remarks, is if you have not read the book When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matters memoir by Patrice Kahn Cullers and Asha Bandeli, really you must read it, because it points to the incredible need today. It's up to date literally today, really for everyone's participation to address a lot of these issues of inequities that are pervasive in the U.S., and it includes issues of mental health and well-being, which is also a really important issue. And our keynote speaker, David Williams, who's going to be introduced more formally by Anna Branch, really has played an important role in this area. So with all that said, this is my history lesson for the day. We really look forward to wonderful collaborations with our community partners, faculty, students, in research and education, and applying programs that improve people's lives and in all the opportunities that such a center can provide. And I want to thank you for helping us launch CCHER, and knowing that we also need everyone's help to make Share the most successful center that it can be to affect change. I will tell you on a side note that Susan and I had a side conversation recently, and she noted that Share, S-H-H-A-R-E, and Share, or perhaps not Share, C-C-H-E-R, could be confusing. And she actually suggested another pronunciation that actually didn't fit the letters, but, you know, you can think out of the box that way. But I think ultimately it's kind of, for me, nice knowing the history to see that S-H-H-A-R-E, which has transformed itself through increasingly the Western Mass Health Equity Summit, Western Mass Health Equity Network, to Share. So it's ultimately a decision that we can throw out to everybody, but I think it's really wonderful to see how the school and the community will have future interactions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Deputy Chancellor Steve Goodwin. Steve has had a long and distinguished career at UMass Amherst. He was the Dean of the College of Natural Sciences for many years and a wonderful colleague with me at that time, so it's been wonderful. And he's been a Deputy Chancellor for about a year now, and please welcome me in joining Steve to the podium.
Well, thank you. It's actually a pleasure to be here for this formal launch of the Center for Community Health Equity Research. And you notice I had to pause before I could say that, because I have a little cognitive challenge with acronyms. So you can imagine the difficulty I had following Marjorie's history. But I do appreciate the history of what it took to get us here to this day and to create this center and to be in a position to do the kind of work that the center is going to do. I've had a chance to interact with Susan and the center. I'm going to keep calling it the center for the rest of my time here. That way I don't have to worry about the acronym anymore. But I had a chance to interact with Susan and the center over the past couple of months. I already have a little sense of some of the good work that's going to go on here. You know, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst is the flagship campus of the university system. We're also the land grant in Massachusetts. And with that comes a responsibility. And one of those responsibilities is to have an impact. So when Marjorie was reading to you from the purpose for the center, she mentioned that that purpose acknowledges that there is a space between academic research and community practice. And the willingness of this center to think about how do we fill that space, how do we do things that fill that space, I think is really important. And it's especially important to the university. So I've had a chance to talk with people in Springfield over the past few months as well. And one of them, who might actually be in this room today, had a phrase that I really liked. The person said, well, we have a lot of these research spasms. They said what basically happens is the university gets some money to do research, they show up, they do the research, and they go away again. And I think that's the thing that we've reached the point where we know we have to do more than that. If we're going to have a true impact on our communities, we have to do significantly more than that. We have to come, we have to do the research in partnership, and then we have to stay, we have to talk about best practices, and we have to work on the implementation side of all of this as well. So I'm looking forward to all of you helping us make that a reality here at UMass Amherst, that we're not just research spasms, but we're true partners with the community. Thank you all very much.
And Anna Branch will be introducing our keynote.
Good morning. I'm Anna Branch. I'm the Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, and I'm delighted to be a part of the campus launch of the Center for Community Health Equity Research, and to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker and a revered sociologist, David Williams. So David R. Williams, PhD, is the Florence and Laura Norman Professor of Public Health and Professor of African American Studies and Sociology at Harvard University. Previously, he taught at Yale University and the University of Michigan. He is internationally recognized as a leading social scientist focused on social influences on health. His research has enhanced our understanding of the complex ways in which race, racism, socioeconomic status, stress, health behaviors, and religious involvement can affect physical and mental health. The everyday discrimination scale he developed is among the most widely used measures of discrimination in health studies around the world. He is the author of more than 400 scholarly papers in scientific journals and edited collections, and his research has appeared in leading journals in sociology, psychology, medicine, public health, and epidemiology. Elected to the Institute of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he has been ranked as one of the world's most influential scientific minds. He holds an MPH from Loma Linda University and a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Williams has also played a visible, national, and increasingly international leadership role in raising awareness of the levels of problems of health disparities and identifying interventions to address them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Williams.
And good morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. And glad to see this wonderful turnout for the start of what will be an important center in making a difference and improving health for many. I thank Anna for her kind words of introduction, and I thank Susan for the invitation to join you on this really important occasion. What I want to do is to talk about some of my vision of issues that the center would address, since there are multiple challenges in the space that the center wants to work in terms of what we can do to address some of the underlying health challenges that we face. I'm going to jump right into my talk since I have a lot of territory to cover. So I want to begin by talking about the problems that we face, and then I'll talk about potential solutions and potential areas of further investigation. So what are the health problems that we face in the United States? I want to begin with one that we often don't think about, and that's the national disparity in terms of health. Everyone in the United States is less healthy than we could or should be. According to the World Bank, half of the money spent in the world annually on medical care is spent in the United States. We are less than 5% of the world's population, consume 1/2 of its medical resources, but rank near the bottom of the industrialized world on health, and we are losing ground over time. And I will be talking a lot about socioeconomic and racial ethnic inequities in health, but even if white America were a country, it would rank 34th in the world on life expectancy. If black America were a country, it would rank 96th in the world on life expectancy. The problem that we don't recognize is that countries like South Korea, Greece, Cyprus, Cuba, and Lebanon, countries that we don't think of as our peers, are doing better in terms of health than we are in the United States. A recent report from the National Academy of Medicine show that even the best of Americans with a college degree or more education who don't smoke and who exercise, have poorer health than their counterparts in Western Europe. So all of us need to do better in terms of health, and then we have large gaps in health for other groups that we need to absolutely close those gaps. So we need to think strategically of a strategy that includes everyone, because we could all be doing better, but then also think of how we lend an extra helping hand to those who have a longer way to go. And then in the United States, there are large socioeconomic inequalities in health. And by socioeconomic status, I refer to differences by income, education, occupational status, and health. And around the world, the single biggest predictor of health is socioeconomic status. Whether the country has a national health service or not, you tell me something about income, education, occupational status, I can tell you who's doing best in terms of health. Here is one example of the socioeconomic gaps in health from a paper we published many years ago, using data from national data from the panel study of income dynamics, looking at overall mortality in the United States, and you could see low-income Americans, those with an income of $25,000 or less, have an overall death rate that is 3 times higher than that of high-income Americans, defined here as incomes above $115,000 annual income per year. But importantly, what you also see here is a gradient effect. It's not a threshold effect. It's not just that the poor or the low income are doing poorly, but every higher level of income is in fact associated with better health. And if socioeconomic status is such a powerful driver of variations in health, it should only be expected that there should be large racial ethnic differences in health, because socioeconomic status is strongly patterned by race, ethnicity in the United States. So in fact, if you look at data for the United States, you see a somewhat complex pattern by race and ethnicity. Groups that have been in the United States for a long time, that can be characterized by what I would call geographic marginalization, social stigmatization. I'm talking about Native Hawaiians, I'm talking about Native Americans, and I'm talking about African Americans. Those groups have much worse health than the US average or than the white population, which is a typical comparison used. We have more evidence for the health of African Americans because that group has been studied more, but to the extent that we have data, patterns for Native Hawaiians and for Native Americans are very similar. And then groups that are heavily made up of immigrants actually tend to have better health. In fact, better health than their native-born counterparts. If you take national data for the United States, looking at infant mortality rates for the country or overall mortality rates for the country, immigrants of all racial groups have better health than their native-born counterparts. White immigrants have better health than whites born in the U.S. Black immigrants have better health than blacks born in the U.S. Asian immigrants have better health than Asians born in the U.S. Latino immigrants have better health than Latinos born in the U.S. Across the board, there's a healthy immigrant effect. That's the good news. The bad news is the longer immigrants stay in the U.S., the worse their health becomes. And this is particularly marked for Latinos and black immigrants in the U.S. And I'll give you a couple quick examples. Data points. This is national data for the United States, looking at black Caribbean immigrants, looking at Latinos, and looking at Asians by generational status. First generation means they're immigrants to the United States. Second generation, they were born in the U.S., their parents were immigrants. Third generation, they were born in the U.S., their parents were born in the U.S., their grandparents were immigrants. And you can see from black Caribbean status, this is the prevalence of DSM-4 defined psychiatric disorder at any time in your lifetime. This does not reflect the impact of treatment. This is from a household-based probability sample, so we have persons in treatment and not in treatment. The same strategy is used in this study across the 3 populations, and you could see for Caribbean blacks and Latinos in particular, you see their prevalence of lifetime psychiatric disorders dramatically increases as they go from the first to the second generation. In fact, by the second generation, they converge to the norm in the U.S. About 35% of Americans meet criteria for ever having had a lifetime psychiatric disorder. So by the second generation, Caribbean blacks and Latinos are there. But by the third generation, they are worse off than the U.S. average. And I don't readily, I've thought about this a lot, and I have yet to come up with a good explanation of why the third generation, who are more removed from immigrant status, their grandparents were immigrants, why are they doing worse? But it's an example of the problem. For Asians, you see the jump from the first to the second generation, not quite a big jump to the third. And someone says, well, that's mental health status, that's self-reported data. I want to give you another example, looking at the Mexican-American population, using allostatic load as the measure. It's a measure of 10 items. These are the 10 items that goes into allostatic load of medically assessed characteristics. And I want you to look at the middle-aged Mexicans. That's the light blue line on this. And if you see, these are the foreign born, these are the US born. If you look at middle-aged Mexicans, 0 to 10 years in the US, their allostatic load, the higher your allostatic load, the greater the degree of biological dysregulation you have, the higher is your risk factor profile. So for 0 to 10 years in the US, middle-aged Mexican Americans have an allostatic load level that is identical to that, not different from that of whites. By 21 or more years in the US, middle-aged Mexican Americans have an allostatic load that is identical to that of US-born Mexicans, which is not statistically different from that of blacks. So the health of middle-aged African Americans moves from that, a profile similar to that of whites, to a profile similar to that of African Americans, just by length of stay in the United States. And those are just examples. We have a large study in Chicago that I've been doing with colleagues at the University of Michigan, where I was when we began the study. And for virtually every health outcome we've looked at, we have about a third of the sample is black, a third Latino, a third white. On every health outcome, every risk factor, whites do best, blacks do worse, Latinos are in the middle. If we simply break out the Latino sample by US-born versus foreign-born on everything we've looked at, US-born Latinos look like African Americans, foreign-born Latinos look like whites. So one of the challenges we face in public health is to try to identify what exactly can we do to reverse this downward trajectory of health for immigrant populations, particularly economically disadvantaged immigrant populations with increasing lengths of stay in the United States. But here's an example of the overall patterns of health we see. This is infant mortality that refers to a baby, the chances of a baby dying before its first birthday. And you could see the rates per 1,000 live births by race ethnicity. And you could see African Americans and Native Americans have markedly elevated risks, with a black baby born in the US being more than twice as likely to die before his or her first birthday than a white infant. These disparities are quite persistent over time. Here is infant mortality rates for blacks and whites from 1950 to the present, and there's good news. You can see for African Americans the rates have gone down, for whites the rates have gone down, but there still is a gap in 2013, and if you look at the relative black-white ratio, in 1950, a black baby was 1.6 times more likely to die before his first birthday. In 2013, it's 2.2 times more likely to die than a white baby before his first birthday. The absolute gap is much narrower, but the relative gap has widened. That's actually an important point to keep in mind, that depends on whether you focus on relative or absolute differences. You would come to different conclusions whether the gap is getting worse or not. I think the absolute gap tells us how things are really shifting. Both are useful indicators, but recognizing the limitations of each is an important point to keep in mind. When my career started, most researchers thought that racial ethnic differences in health was simply a function of racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. And if you looked at persons of different racial ethnic groups at the same level of education or income, race would no longer matter. We now know that life is more complicated than that, and I want to give you two examples, both using national data, to illustrate the pattern. So at age 25, how long does the average person live? The average white person at age 25 in the United States lives 5 years longer than the average African American. So there's a 5-year gap by race. But if we look within whites by education or income level, I'll show you the education data only in the interest of time, you can see that on average, a white person with a college degree or more education lives 6.4 years longer than a white person who has not finished high school. Importantly, and this is true in most national data for most health outcomes, the gaps by socioeconomic status in the United States are larger than the gaps by race. 6.4 is larger than 5. Just making sure we're on the same page. Okay? And within African Americans, the gap is also 5.3. Again, bigger than the black-white gap. The gap between a black with a college degree or more education, gap at less than high school. So this is true for most health outcomes, and it is a sociology of knowledge question as to why, as a society, we almost exclusively look at all the federal reports on inequalities. Do they talk about socioeconomic inequalities? No, they don't. They only present racial data. And I have been recommending, even when I served on a federal advisory committee mandated by Congress to advise the Secretary of Health and Human Services on the collection of data, we've recommended report the data jointly by race and socioeconomic status together, because you get a better picture of what are the real drivers of inequalities and how they operate. So let's take a look at race and socioeconomic status together. What we find is that at every level of education, race still matters. So white high school dropouts at age 25 live 3.1 years longer than black high school dropouts, and that difference increases as education increases. So it's 4.3 years among college graduates. In fact, here is one of the most stunning statistics I will show you today. And remember, this is national data for the United States. The best off African Americans, those with a college degree or more education, have lower life expectancy than whites with a similar level of education, lower life expectancy than whites with some college education, lower life expectancy than whites who've graduated from high school. So these data clearly indicate that there's something about socioeconomic status, income and education. The pattern is true for income. You can look at the Braveman et al. Paper that we did, the income data is there. The pattern is true for both. There's something profound about income and education that is a driver of health. But there's something else about race that matters, even after you've taken income and education into account. I'll just give you one other example, national data for the United States. This is infant mortality by mothers' education. This is the infant mortality rates for blacks, Hispanics, and whites with less than high school, some college degree. And you see as infant mortality, as mothers' education increases, infant mortality rates decline. That's true for all groups. But you still see this towering excess risk for African American women. So the best of African American women still have an infant mortality rate that is almost 3 times higher than that of their similarly educated counterparts who are white or Latino. And stunningly, the best of African American women have a higher rate of infant mortality than white women and Latino women who've dropped out from high school. So again, race still matters profoundly after you've taken income and education into account. Why does race still matter? There are 4 reasons. Reason number 1, health is affected not only by your current economic status, but by what you've been exposed to over the life course. So let's think about the college-educated African-American women I just talked about. They're more likely to have been born low birth weight, more likely to have been born poor, more likely to have experienced deficits in access to nutrition, access to high-quality medical care over their lifetime. And our bodies keep a record of all that we're exposed to. So it's not only your current economic status that matters, but what you've experienced over your entire life. And there's increasing evidence of not just what you experienced during your mother's womb, where there's research that came out earliest from Scandinavia looking at preconception stress. And that is the stress in the life of your mother within the year before she became pregnant is predictive of increased infant mortality rates. There's a 50% higher infant mortality rates in Sweden among mothers who experience preconception stress, a major stressful event the year prior to her becoming pregnant. So that's one factor. All indicators of socioeconomic status are not equivalent across race. What do I mean by that? Well, national data for the U.S. tells us that compared to whites, blacks and Latinos receive less income at the same levels of education. So if you use education as a marker of income, your race determines how much income you actually receive at the same level of education. They have less wealth at equivalent levels of income, and there's a purchasing power difference, which is a dramatic example of how life is not fair. You see, on average, blacks and Latinos live in worse neighborhoods. But research shows that the cost of goods and services are higher for the poor and minority in disadvantaged neighborhoods than for persons in suburban contexts. So the price per square foot is higher in inner city neighborhoods than it is in suburban communities. The cost of insurance is higher, the cost of gasoline is higher, the cost of food products in the supermarket. I actually do that sometimes. I go to the same supermarket chain in different neighborhoods and just check out the prices. The prices vary in the same chain from neighborhoods. And it's not just supermarket neighborhoods. Research shows that pharmacy prices differ in the same pharmacy chain by what neighborhood it's located in. So a dollar in the hands of a minority person doesn't stretch as far in the U.S. on average. And then racism matters. I'm going to talk at length about racism. I'm not going to comment more on that. And minorities also have high exposure to multiple stressors. I'll also comment on that before, a little later. So what do I mean when I say racism? And what does racism have to do with health anyhow? I just spoke to the board of a major foundation in the United States because the president of the foundation said his board is having trouble. They went on a community meeting and community people kept talking about structural racism and half the board had no clue what exactly they were talking about. So I think of racism as not resident primarily in the beliefs or behaviors of individuals, but racism as an organized system. It's something systemic, it's something embedded and structured in our society. It categorizes and ranks persons based on an ideology of inferiority, that some persons are better off than others. It differentially allocates opportunities and resources to individuals based on this ranking. It's deeply embedded in an ideology of inferiority, which is also deeply embedded in the culture. And that structure, that system of racism can lead to differences in beliefs and attitudes, prejudice, stereotypes. It can lead to differential treatment both by individuals and social institutions. But racism is primarily this system. And there are multiple ways I have written about the ways in which racism can affect health, and I will elaborate on some of them today, that there are institutional mechanisms of racism, and I'll define that for you in a minute, like segregation. There's internalized racism. There is increased exposure to traditional stressors, and there's self-reported mechanisms of racism. I'm going to illustrate some of these, don't have time to delve into all of them. But one big issue is, what do we mean by the distinction between individual or institutional discrimination? And I use institutional and structural discrimination interchangeably, as sociologists have historically done. There's some folks now recently trying to make a big point of difference between the two, and I don't think we should waste time on niceties like that. So I'm using the terms interchangeably personally. So what do I mean by the difference? And I want to give you a concrete example so you get a sense of it. Researchers at Portland State University ask a simple question. When a person in this great city of Portland, where I visited earlier this year, stands at a crosswalk waiting to cross the street, does your race determine how long you have to wait to cross the street? Do drivers differentially yield to persons of some racial groups versus others? So to test this, they took 3 black males and 3 white males and dressed them the same way and put them at different intersections in the city of Portland and looked to see what would happen. And they found that multiple cars were twice as likely to pass a black person waiting to cross the street, and that blacks had to wait 32% longer to cross the street. That's individual discrimination. We're talking about what individual drivers did when they saw the stimulus of someone intending to cross the street. I want to give you an example of institutional discrimination. How long did people have to stand in line waiting to vote in the 2012 presidential election? This is national data for the United States. And we found, on average, black people waited 23 minutes, white people waited 12 minutes. None of that reflected individual behavior of precinct workers. Precinct workers were not discriminated against blacks or Latinos or Asian Americans who waited longer than whites on average. Those differences were largely driven by where you voted and what were the administrative procedures, the budget allocations, the number of precinct workers per population, the size of the precinct. The point is, it was institutional processes and administrative procedures that determined the resources available at local precincts, but nonetheless led to systematic differences in how long people voted. And when we talk about institutional or structural racism, we're talking about racism that is embedded in policies, that the people, the precinct workers, have no animosity in their heart and are treating everyone exactly the same way, but there are systematic differences in terms of outcome. In my TED Talk, I mentioned that the secret source that drives racial inequality in America is an institutional mechanism of racism called residential segregation. It was born in the late 19th century, implemented well between about 1890 and 1940, and even though it's illegal today, it still is locked in place, and it has pervasive negative effects on health. John Sell, a historian at Duke University, wrote a book about the origins of segregation in the U.S. South and South Africa. He showed that the framers of apartheid in South Africa, early 20th century, looked across the Atlantic and saw segregation as implemented in the United States, and they said, brilliant, we can adapt that in South Africa. Importantly, Sell argues that residential segregation by race was one of the single most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the United States. Because it's beneath the radar screen, politicians are not talking about it, but I will show you in a minute what empirical research shows the powerful negative effects it has on shaping access to opportunity in American society. And you say, well, what does place have to do with anything? Well, where you live determines, for most Americans, where you go to school, determines your access to quality education, determines your access to employment opportunities, determines the quality of neighborhood and housing environments, determines whether it's easy or difficult to exercise in your neighborhood or safe to exercise in the neighborhood, determines your access to fresh fruits and vegetables, determines exposures to physical, chemical stressors in the environment, determines the quality of municipal services. So a lot of opportunities and resources in American society are patterned by place. There's some recent qualitative research that I think public health researchers could learn from in terms of looking at the differences in the quality of life in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods and identified a number of stressors. This is the work of Kathy Eden and her colleagues. The number of stressors linked to the physical environment for many poor persons in high-rise public housing. Stressors as well linked to the social environment and their broad range of exposures that individuals face in very different contexts in the United States. Two of America's most eminent sociologists, William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, studied 171 largest cities in the United States and said there's not even one city where whites live under equal conditions to blacks because of segregation, and that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of black communities. In fact, research indicates that the reason that there are racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status is linked to segregation. Drawing here in the work of David Cutler, one of the country's leading economists, until recently the dean of the social sciences in Harvard College, using fancy econometric models I cannot even fully describe, but he's able to show statistically that if you could only eliminate residential segregation in the United States, you would completely erase black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce black-white differences in single motherhoods by 2/3. All of that is driven by inequalities and opportunities linked to place. So segregation, place, is a powerful driver of inequalities in American society. How big are these inequalities in American society? Hey, it's 2015 annual household income by race for the United States from the U.S. Census Bureau. I have just put them in a way you can't possibly miss the point. So I'm standardizing on the income of whites and using the household income of whites as $1. For every dollar of household income whites receive, Asian households receive $1.23. Asian households are heavily made up of immigrants. 70% of Asians are immigrants. Asian households have the highest levels of education of any population in the United States. Most Asian subgroups have levels of education that's more than twice that of whites. I need to note in passing that all the racial ethnic populations I am talking about are characterized by the fancy word academics use as heterogeneity. What we mean by that is dramatic variation. So even though Asians have the highest levels of income, there's subgroups of Asians, the Hmong, the Cambodian, and the Laotian, that have lower levels of income than African Americans and American Indians. So when you're working with a community, these broad labels of Latino, of white, of black, of Asian, have to be unpacked as what is the specific population you're dealing with. So that's a point in passing. But if you look at the historically disadvantaged groups, for every dollar of household income in 2015, white households receive, Latino households receive 72 cents, Native American households 62 cents, African Americans households 59 cents. Do you know what is stunning about the 59 cents figure? That is identical to the racial gap in income in 1978. I did not misspeak. You heard me correct. In 1978, black households earned 59 cents for every dollar whites earned. And in 2015, that's exactly where blacks are. Most of my students think we have made so much more progress than that. And it's not that the number has been invariant over time. I picked 78 because 78 was the peak year of the narrowing of the black-white gap in income as a result of the anti-poverty policies of the 60s and early 70s and the civil rights movement. Throughout the decade of the 80s, it fell from the 59 cents figure. And it wasn't until 1994 that blacks got back up to 59 cents. And they've just been up and down above it since then. So there are large economic inequities in the US. Remember, I showed you high-quality empirical research using sophisticated causal models shows segregation is responsible for it. And the income data dramatically understates racial differences in economic circumstances because income captures the flow of resources into the household. It tells us nothing about the economic reserves that households have to cushion shortfalls of income. We get that from data on wealth. Your reserves, your savings, your stocks and bonds, your additional property, the equity in your home. And what the research shows, the most recent census data on wealth, that for every dollar of household wealth, whites have, blacks have 6 pennies and Latinos have 7 pennies. And by the way, there are no racial differences in savings behavior at equivalent levels of income. Okay? So we have systematic, dramatic racial inequities in health. But the take-home point for right now is that these racial differences in economic circumstances didn't just happen. They're not acts of God. They're not random events. They reflect the successful implementation of social policy. They look at institutional mechanisms of racism that have done exactly what they were intended to do. One research priority is that we need to identify multiple other pathways of structural racism and its health consequences. I'm not going to talk about that in the interest of time. We also need to better understand the health impact of the increasing racism in the larger culture. Racism in the culture is a part of it. We are in an era of increasing hate in the United States. Empirical research shows that era of increasing hate did not begin with the Trump campaign or the Trump election. It began with Obama's election and the reaction to Obama's election. In response to Obama being elected, 1 in 3 whites said they were troubled that a black man was in the White House. We had this rise of the Tea Party with racist rhetoric. We have the Democratic Party being savage in the polls, the greatest losses in recent memory. We have less white support for addressing racial inequity. Both whites who voted for Obama and whites who did not vote for him said because he's in the White House, there's less need to address racial inequity, and they will be less supportive of efforts to address racial inequity. There was a spike, research has shown, in online context, not in mainstream media, but in online context, research has shown with Obama's election came a dramatic increase in hate websites and hate Facebook pages. And many kind of traditional racial stereotypes that are not seen in racial media are very much alive in online context. And then we had the Trump campaign emerge with a negative hostility towards immigrants, Muslims, racial and sexual minorities. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study looking at 2,000 K-12 teachers in the United States and found that 2/3 of the teachers said that some of their students expressed concerns or fears about what might happen after the election More than a third of teachers said in their classrooms they've seen an increase in anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiment. More than half of the teachers said that some of their students are emboldened to use slurs and name-calling and said bigoted and hostile things about minorities, immigrants, and others in the United States. And the Trump election has given new legitimacy to hate in America. A congressman running from Tennessee had all over his district these large billboards saying, "Making America White Again." This is a dugout in upstate New York. It's not just in the South. And in the wake of Trump's election, there was a well-documented increase in hate crimes and harassment. And according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the most common site in the U.S. of hate crimes and harassment of individuals was K through 12 schools. Our children is where most of the action is taking place. This is a national public opinion survey from the American Psychological Association in January 2017 that find high proportions of Americans said they are stressed out by the recent election. You can see 57% of Asians, 69% of African Americans, 56% of Latinos, 42% of whites, even 26% of Republicans said they were stressed out by the results of the election. Why does this matter? And what does this have to do with health? And is Dr. Williams just making a political statement? No. This has profoundly to do with health. I want to share with you a couple studies that show how racially prejudiced your community is actually matters for your health of minorities who live in those communities. So this is one example of a study that looked at the General Social Survey, is a large social indicator survey that measures racial attitudes, and these researchers accumulated them over time and looked by geography and looked at mortality outcomes in those areas. And they found that adults reporting more anti-black prejudice had an increased odds of mortality of 11%, but residing in an area with more anti-black prejudice increased in residents' odds of death by 31%. So if you live in a highly prejudiced area, your rate of death, your mortality risk is actually increased. Researchers have been very creative. A group of political scientists did Google searches for the N-word by geography. And in places where there were more Google searches for the N-word, they could predict votes for Obama or against Obama. And so health researchers have used the same strategy. If Google searches for the N-word actually predicts political behavior, does it predict health? And what they found in areas of more Google searches for the N-word, there is higher all-cause mortality among African Americans that corresponds to over 30,000 excess deaths per year among blacks in areas where more people are doing Google searches for the N-word. We still don't fully understand research, the mechanisms that drive these differences, but it's a striking body of work, and there are more studies. In the interest of time, I just showed you a couple that illustrates this. But at the individual level, there's a lot of discrimination. And the high-quality study I showed you at a little earlier of discrimination at a crosswalk, those kinds of, we call them audit studies, where you hold everything the same, you just vary the race of the person, have been documented in all kinds of domains of American life. And I could take 2 hours just to describe these studies, and they are striking. I don't have the time. But just trust me, there's a lot of discrimination. I have been interested in one subset of discrimination. That's discrimination that an individual is aware of, has identified, you know that or feel that you have been discriminated against. And I've developed measures to capture discrimination. One of them is the everyday discrimination scale that doesn't capture the big things, but captures the little things. Treated with less courtesy or respect, receive poorer service than others. People act as if you are not smart, as if they are afraid of you, as if they think you are dishonest. And I want to show you how powerful the research is by drawing on the research of one researcher, Dr. Tenny Lewis, was a faculty at Yale University when she did this study. Each line on this slide represents a different study. In all of the studies, the exposure is everyday discrimination, and then looking at different health outcomes. So high levels of everyday discrimination for people followed over 5 years predicts the development of subclinical heart disease as measured by coronary artery calcification. Higher levels of everyday discrimination in another study predicts higher levels of inflammation. High levels of everyday discrimination predicts higher blood pressure. Among pregnant women who report everyday discrimination, they give birth to lower birth weight infants. A study of the elderly followed over time. Everyday discrimination is an independent predictor of more rapid declines in cognitive function over time. A community sample, everyday discrimination predicts poorer sleep. A study of adults followed over time. Everyday discrimination is an independent predictor of premature death. Discrimination is an independent predictor of death. A study of African American and white women with looking at this relationship to abdominal obesity. Everyday discrimination was unrelated to what we call subcutaneous fat. That's the fat right under your skin in the abdominal area. But a strong dose-response relationship between everyday discrimination and visceral fat. Visceral fat is the deep internal abdominal fat, and what's important about that is visceral fat that's the driver of elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a broad range of other outcomes. So just this slide illustrates the multiple ways in which discrimination has negative consequences for health. Most studies of discrimination have not assessed its impact on health disparities. But now we have studies from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States that shows when you look at racial differences in health and you statistically adjust income and education, and there still is a residual effect, if you add self-reported discrimination, it explains, it makes an added contribution to accounting for racial differences in health. When I developed the measures of discrimination, the research, the qualitative research that I was reading suggested that discrimination affects health not only through actual exposure, but also through the threat of exposure. And that people were making steps even before they left home in the morning because of the threat of discrimination out there. And so I developed what I call the heightened vigilance scale, and there have been a number of papers using the heightened vigilance scale, particularly by Maggie Hicken, one of my collaborators in recent years. And we find that persons who are engaging in activity to protect themselves from discrimination, this threat of discrimination, the vigilance for discrimination, predicts health over and above the effects of actual discrimination itself. So we find effects of discrimination, of actual exposure, but we also find effects of the threat of exposure. One of the research priorities for the center is for us to better understand discrimination over the life course. This is a review by Naomi Priest, one of my Australian colleagues I work with, and she has documented this review 121 studies looking at discrimination in children and adolescents. There are, for example, studies that are looking at what we call parent-to-child discrimination. So studies find that discrimination in the life of the parent affects the health of the adolescent. And there's a body of work along those lines. This is a study out of the UK that looked at discrimination among parents and the consequences for their children over time. And they found that racial insults experienced by the mother negatively impacted the mother's health 2 years later and affected the child's socioeconomic emotional development 4 years later. Racial insults from the mother that the mother experienced directly affect the children's emotional health, and racial insults and being treated badly was linked to harsh parenting practices over time, which also directly affect children's emotional being. So it's an example of a longitudinal study that is actually tracing the pathways by which discrimination adversely impacts health. Here's one other study about individual discrimination that I want to tell you about. This is the work of Gene Brody and his colleagues at University of Georgia. He's been studying a cohort of African American young people. And in his cohort, he measured the discrimination among these teenagers at 16, 17, and 18. By age 20, I didn't say age 40, I said age 20, kids who were consistently high on discrimination as a teenager have higher levels of stress hormones. That's high levels of cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, as well as systolic and diastolic blood pressure, inflammation, and BMI. by age 20. So we are seeing the adverse consequences of discrimination exposure on health as early as age 20 in young adolescents. We need to better understand the life course and how these processes operate. We also, one of the things that discourages me somewhat is that people call me and tell me, I've heard you develop this measure to assess discrimination, and they want to use it in a study, and it's the only aspect of minority life they want to capture. So discrimination is a stressor. It's a neglected stressor, but minorities face all kinds of other stressors. Here's an example of the study we did in Chicago where we measured discrimination, but we measured acute life events and financial stress, and childhood adversity and work stress and relationship stress and neighborhood stress. And what we find is a dose-response relationship. The more of those stresses you experience, the worse is your health. And so we need to assess stress comprehensively in terms of understanding its impact on health. And this is the Chicago study again that shows a graded association between the number of stresses and poor health, and we find that stress exposure, including discrimination, helps to explain the racial gap in health after income and education is adjusted for. What can we do about all of these challenges? Can we do anything about minimizing the negative effects of discrimination on health? Research suggests that yes, there are some resources that individuals who experience discrimination use that is protective. One of them is high levels of social support. And this is the same study, Eugene Brody study, this negative effects of discrimination by age 20 for kids in rich supportive relationships. That association is not there. Other research finds high levels of church-based support and religious involvement, high levels of psychological characteristics such as optimism, buffers or protects individuals given exposure to discrimination from some of its negative effects. Can we do anything about reducing individual biases? I usually point people to the Divine solution. Professor Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has put together in a single program the strategies that have been identified by social psychologists to reduce both implicit and explicit discrimination, and they work, and they are evident in individuals 3 months later. 3 months later may not sound like a long time, but it's the longest that has yet been shown in a psychological study, because most studies of interventions look at the impact at the end of the program, and she shows the effect is sustained 3 months later. I would strongly encourage you to think beyond cultural diversity training, to think also of structural diversity training. Because individuals, the implicit biases that we all have, also shape policies that we develop. And we need to get a better understanding of the way implicit biases creates institutional discrimination and the policies that they have created in multiple sectors of society. I'll come back to that in a minute. What else do we need to do? Well, there's more to health than healthcare. And as we think of what needs to be done to address health and address the epidemics of chronic disease, we need to think of all the other forces, the other social determinants that drive health in the first place. What I'm saying is we need to go upstream, look at some of the non-medical determinants of health, and heavily focus on place-based solutions given the power of segregation and shaping opportunities linked to place. Healthier lifestyles are needed in the United States if we're going to have health, and we can list the health behaviors where we need to improve. This is a study colleagues and I did looking at smokers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of the U.S.'s most segregated cities. And what we find is that people who are currently smoking have higher levels of stress across multiple domains of stress. It means then that an effective stop smoking program is not just helping the person to quit, but it's helping the person to deal with the stresses in life. And we have a project I was involved with in Massachusetts where we provided persons interested in quitting who'd call the quit line, a randomized control design. Some of them were randomized to go to talk to a social worker who could help them talk through the challenges they face, who could also refer them to resources, and their success in quitting was much greater. So we need to think of what are the underlying drivers of the health behaviors and think of how we can address them in order to be effective. One of the other things we need to do is to start early. The negative effects of our environments on health begin very early in life. And if we can intervene early, there are striking examples. This is an example of the Abecedarian Project in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where poor kids, 80% of them African American, are randomized to receive an early childhood intervention at birth. The average age at which they enter this program is at 3 months old. And for 0 to 5, they are in this stimulating environment where they receive high-quality medical care, good intellectual stimulation, good nutrition, and so on. By their mid-30s, markedly lower levels of cardiometabolic risk. Here is an example of the systolic blood pressure levels in the control group who didn't get the intervention, and the intervention group. You can see marked lower levels of blood pressure, but a lot of other cardiometabolic risk factors are lower by the 30s, linked to what we offered those kids birth through 5. We also need to improve economic well-being. Over the last 60 years, the black-white gap in mortality has widened or narrowed along with the black-white gap in income. So during the decade of the 80s, where things got worse, the life expectancy of African Americans was reduced from the 1984 level for 5 years in a row, when exactly the income gap widened. What else do we need to do? There's a lot of talk about resilience. But a lot of the conversations about resilience think of resilience as an individual characteristic. And of course, I just showed you some resilience factors that exist. But we also need to realize resilience is embedded in social policy. And we can create environments that are more resilient by promoting economic well-being. So policy interventions can also provide resilience. Let me give you a concrete example with child poverty rate. The US ranks 34th in the world on child poverty. And in fact, child poverty is not randomly distributed. 1/3 of black kids and Native American kids and 1/4 of Latino kids are poor. Although if we look numerically, the largest number of poor kids in the US are Native Latino, and the second largest number of poor kids in the US are white. Just keep that in mind. The rate is different, but then numerically, that's what we have. What I want to show you here, this is so important. This is a child poverty rate in different countries as produced by the economy, and the child poverty rate after taxes and transfers. What do I mean by taxes and transfers? The policy decisions we make are taxes and transfers. So look at Ireland. The child poverty rate produced by the economy is 42%. But after the Irish people reflect their values and put in place policies to support children, it's cut to 8%. And you can see other countries. In the US, our economy produces a child poverty rate of 24%. And after we do all we do, we cut it 1 percentage point. So it shows that other countries that start out with a high child poverty rate are making decisions to protect their kids. What else do we need to do? We need to keep the safety net in place as a resilience strategy. We don't have to guess what happens. This is what happened in 1981. 500,000 people lost welfare, 1 million people lost food stamps, 600,000 people were dropped from Medicaid, 250 federally qualified health centers were closed across the United States, 1 million children lost reduced-price school meals. The WIC program had enough money to serve 1/3 of those eligible. What were the health impacts? Within a year, devastating health impacts on the number of pregnant women with anemia, increases in low birth weight nationally in the United States, increases in infant mortality among poor populations in 20 states, increases in health problems among middle-aged and older persons dropped from Medi-Cal, a study done in California. So pervasive negative effects. There are proposals in Washington, D.C. right now to savage the social safety net, and there will be consequences for populations. We need to monitor policy changes, we need to document the impact on health, but more importantly, we need advocacy to keep and strengthen the very fragile safety net that we have in the United States. We also need to dismantle institutional racism. That is not easy because racism affects multiple systems, but these systems affect all of the subsystems so that you cannot solve the racism problem by addressing one system. You have to think of strategies that have pervasive ripple effects once you address one factor like segregation, so it would have residual effects across population groups. One strategy to do that is place-based strategies, improving neighborhood and housing. And research suggests if we improve neighborhood and housing, we will improve health, randomized controlled trials, change someone's neighborhood, do nothing else. Moved into a better neighborhood, health improves. Let me give you a dramatic example that this can be done. Purpose-built communities in Eastlake, Atlanta, took a public housing project where 90% of the families were victims of a felony every year, where 13% of able-bodied adults were employed. A school that was the worst performing school, one of the worst performing schools in the state of Georgia. And if you come to the villages of Eastlake today, there's been a 90% reduction in violent crime. 50% of residents still qualify for public housing. All able-bodied adults are employed. The school, elementary school, in which 60% of the students still qualify for reduced price lunch, it's one of the best performing in the state of Georgia. It shows it can be done when the community and the government, with a wealthy philanthropist, came together to change the underlying opportunities in a place. It's a dramatic place. I visited it 2 years ago. It's dramatic what they've done. Purpose-built communities is providing free technical assistance to any community in the United States that wants to replicate their model. And there are 18 purpose-built community sites. Some are up and running, like in Charlotte and in New Orleans, possible to be done. I want to conclude with what is holding us back. We know what to do. We know it works. I haven't talked about this, but many of these interventions actually save money. What is holding us back? What is the elephant in the room why we aren't making more progress? And I would say there are 3 communication challenges. One is most Americans are unaware that inequalities by race, ethnicity even exist. People are not mobilized to address a problem if they don't even know it exists. 2, those who know don't care. That's the only way to say it. Scientists use more fancy words. We say there's an empathy gap, but there isn't political will to do anything about it. Back in 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro, has a chapter on Negro health, points to all the statistics. And he says towards the end of the chapter, the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race. And Du Bois continued, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. Scientists today call it the empathy gap. We just don't care. One quick last study I'm going to show you today, a disturbance study. Group of researchers brought kids, mainly white kids, age 5, age 7, age 10. They showed them vignettes of the same picture, a person being stuck in the arm with a needle. Some of the targets were black and some were white. They asked them for each person they saw, how much pain do you think the person was experiencing? At age 5, there is no difference in the pain experienced by a black person, the kids are reporting, versus the pain experienced by a white person. By age 7, there is a tendency for the white kids to report that the black person is feeling less pain. By age 10, it is pronounced. Why does that matter? Because when you lack empathy, you don't vote for policies to help groups that you don't care about. And I want to give you one example of this. This is a study done. There are lots of studies done like this by political scientists and political sociologists. In the national study, the people are asked, would you support giving businesses or industry a tax break for locating in poor areas, high unemployment areas? Or half the sample is asked, would you support a policy for giving tax breaks located in black areas? What they find, when whites are asked the question, poor areas, 70% of whites would support it. If the same question asked them for black areas, only 43%. There's a 27% point difference in support among African Americans. There is a small difference, but a 4% difference in support. what research shows is when you lack empathy, you don't vote for it. You don't care about it. You aren't mobilized to address it. And one of the challenges we face as a scientific question is how do we tell the story of the plight of the disadvantaged in a way that emotionally connects with the public? Because we are a compassionate people. But how do we tell the story in a way that we understand and we feel it? Because emotions drive empathy, that we are willing to do something about it. We need to build community capacity. Let me end that racism exists. It's a driver of health in all kinds of powerful ways, and one of our biggest challenges is to identify how we build the emotional connection and create the political will to make a difference. I leave you with two quotations. Martin Luther King said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar, but it understands that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring." We have structural edifices that are producing beggars, and we need to restructure them. And finally, I leave you with the words of Robert Kennedy. Each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And those ripples can build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. It is my hope, my vision, my expectation that this center will be a place that builds ripples of hope. And together we can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have at least 10 minutes for questions, and we have a microphone set up in the middle. Hopefully you can reach that to ask your question, and if you're in a far-flung corner of the room, we might be able to run one around.
You're welcome. Okay.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what I don't think we heard in your talk was for the institutional part of this, whether there's also baked in a process by which, because so many of these resources are finite, that maintaining it produces a redistribution that, of course, favors the advantaged group or groups. And that any of these changes will require recognition of how the advantage of the advantaged groups has been subsidized and is being subsidized. I mean, if these were infinite resources and we could talk about each of them in this way, then this wouldn't be the case. But because most of them are finite, is there an implicit subsidization for the advantaged that the disadvantaged are subsidizing? And there may be an empathy gap, sure, but is anyone doing analysis to test whether this is like a resource redistribution that's no one's talking about in this way?
So your question is a very good one. There needs to be a resource distribution, but it's not as marked as we might think it needs to be. So let's take medical care, for example. The United States is the only industrialized country that doesn't guarantee access to medical care as a right. We spend more, absolutely, per person on medical care than any other country. And I showed you the World Bank estimates we spend 50% of the money spent in the world. So the problem of covering all Americans is not a question. There is more than enough money in what we're currently spending to provide health care for everyone. The question is, it's being spent in certain ways. And it's not being spent in efficient ways, and it doesn't focus on prevention, but it's maldistributed. And much more importantly, I'm getting in trouble here, but we have an insurance industry that estimates that uses 20 to 30% of all our healthcare expenditure goes to the insurance industry. How much care does the insurance industry deliver? No? I mean, how much? Anybody can tell me? Precisely. So we can organize things. There is enough money to cover everyone. And in fact, one of the challenges, and by the way, sociologists and political scientists have studied this for a long time. There are many whites in the United States who, in elections, vote against their own economic interests. I have written a paper with one of my former students, Jennifer Mallett, in Social Science and Medicine, on the effects of whiteness on the health of whites, documenting the ways in which racism is also harming the health of whites. Because it's well documented by research since the 1930s that there are policies that would help all Americans that many politicians have not supported because they saw it as a handout to minorities. But in so doing, it has hurt all low-income Americans, including low-income white Americans. There are more poor white people in America than poor black people. So that, in fact, the policies, if we took a rational approach to them, could actually help to lift all ships in the United States, and there is enough resources to do that. But it would say that the 1% and the 2%, that's where who would get a lot less. And you are absolutely right. There are persons and industries that benefit from the system the way it is, and they don't want the gravy train to be adversely impacted. But at the population level, it would provide better outcomes for everyone. So I think part of the challenge is to raise awareness levels so that our political system is such that I think the way the House is organized, where the minute someone gets elected in the House, you have to start campaigning because in 2 years is the next election. And certainly you pay attention to who feeds you because you have another campaign to run. And people only our elected representatives only act differently if there is pressure from below. Then they have a reason not to go with what the lobbyist says. And so I think there's more that needs to be done. And by the way, let me say something that over the last 3 years I say to every class I teach. And I do teach both undergraduate and graduate students. And in every class now, I look at my students and say that some of you, and that's true at UMass Amherst, some of you need to run for political office. Because the choices we have is reflective of who is sitting around the table. And it's not enough for us to sit back and criticize and not get involved. We as citizens, we need to get involved, and some of us, and I'm not saying every single person, but some of you need to. And that doesn't mean you have to give up your profession. Last semester, in one of my graduate courses, I had a senator from the state of Oregon join my class live via Skype, so that my student, she's a physician trained at UMass. And now she's a senator in Oregon, and she's led a number of initiatives to improve health of people in Oregon. Practicing physician, state senator, making a difference. And I want more students to think you can actually make a difference at a local level, at a state level, get engaged. These are choices you need to be informed with. You have this information, put it to work. Another question. Yes.
I guess okay, thank you. I guess I have a comment and two questions. The comment is, I try to avoid watching the videos of black men getting shot or strangled by police. so I avoid that. So my question is, do you have research? One question is, do you have research about the effect on people's health of watching these videos? And the other question, I feel like I put my health at risk by being at this presentation. And so the second question is, do you feel you put your health at risk by doing the research that you do?
I don't. This morning, while I got up early, was working on something, someone had sent this clip, and I played it while I was at work. And it was the speech that Martin Luther King did before the night before he was assassinated. And in that speech, he made the case that if he had a conversation with God, and God had asked him, what era in the world's history would you want to live? When would you live? And he walked through the Greece and Rome and with eloquence that I can't even capture. And he said he would say to God, the place and time I want to live is now, in this period of the world's history, because people were rising up and demanding their rights. Whether you looked at South Africa, whether you looked at the US, and he said that this period of time was the time in which we would live. So I get asked this question a lot. Over my career, and I've been 30 years as an academic, I have seen dramatic changes. I am encouraged by my students and by their commitments and to issues of equity and justice. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's greater awareness of these issues. We have a long way to go. So the question is the glass half full or half empty? And I see the glass is half full. It's half full. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But honestly, we've come a long way. I've talked about racism like no problem. The earliest papers I wrote about racism, I would get reviewers from social science journals, not medical journals, social science journals saying, the term racism does not belong in a scientific paper. Racism is an ideological concept that cannot be measured. Okay, I mean, so have things gotten better? Yes. Do we still have major challenges to address? Yes. But I think there is a lot to celebrate of the progress that we have made, even though we still, I wrote a paper for an award I received from the American Sociological Association that I called it Miles to Go Before We Sleep. We have a long ways to go, but we've come a long way. So that's how I would see it. On your specific question of are there consequences, there are some papers looking at the mental health consequences of exposure to violence in general. I have a paper under review with colleagues. My colleagues are the drivers of the paper. I don't want to take more credit than I deserve, but I'm a co-author of this paper under review. We should hear from Lancet every day. Got a good revise and resubmit, and we just resubmitted it, so I don't know. But it looks using the Behavioral Risk Factors Survey, looking at the states over the last several years where there have been major police shootings of black men, looking at the mental health days reported by minorities who live in those states. And yes, we are finding more sick mental health days being reported by persons in a state where there was a shooting of an unarmed black man. So it's not published yet. We will see whether the Lancet eventually accepts it or not. One last question I think we have time for.
Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. I was just wondering if there's been any discussion, or I'm sure there has, studies around the way, and you did allude to this and mention this, that people like Trump and the 1% have actually fostered racism, and like it benefits them directly to actually divide people at the bottom, and that it's benefiting them directly to do that, and they have an interest in doing that, and to see where that racism is coming directly top down, that he has spread that more. And then also I do see hope in that social movements like Black Lives Matter. I think there has been statistics that have come out around that when people see movements like like Black Lives Matter, that it actually changed white people's minds and has actually forced them to think about racism more, or forced them to have a little bit more empathy or understand the role of police in society and what they actually do and the high levels of racism of police in society. And so that what we need is more social movements actually on the ground, like Black Lives Matter, to actually can help change and hopefully work against this empathy gap. Thank you.
So on the first question, has there been research documenting? Yes, it's well studied by political scientists and political sociologists. You can, I'm not sure if there's a Wikipedia entry on the topic, but Google the Southern Strategy. That's what it's called. It was an explicit policy taken by the Republican Party in the 60s that they would use race to gain strength for the Republican Party. And there are books written on it, there are multiple articles written on it. It's called the Southern Strategy. So it was explicit. The only thing different about Trump is that Trump is explicit in his racism. But it has been used by Republican politicians. It's been well studied for a long time. So when President Reagan would say there is a woman on welfare in Chicago with all these children driving a Cadillac, he never said race, but everybody knew he was talking about a black woman. Because the Republican Party is historically, and this is also studied, that this is not ideology, I'm saying, you can go in political science. By the way, the Republican Congress has voted multiple times in the last 5 years that the National Science Foundation should not fund research by political scientists. Because if you read the research by political scientists, they document all of these factors. But so yes, it's well known in academic circles, well documented, and so on. Trump has just been explicit, but it's been used as a wedge issue historically, but usually through code words, what are called code words in the literature. On the impact of things like Black Lives Matter, have they had positive impacts for some whites? Yes. And have raised awareness for some whites? Yes. But they've also had the opposite effect, if I would be honest. And there are whites who have been even more turned off and are more opposed. And I think this is complex that I don't have time to go into in the time we have. What I would suggest that you do, there is an organization called Frameworks Institute. It's a communication organization, and they do research on how to talk about different topics. They deal with a lot of progressive issues. They're on their website, they a research on how do most Americans think about race, and why is it that the appeals that most activists supportive of racial inequality are using don't work. And they have suggestions of alternatives that would work based on their own research. And I don't believe that the Frameworks Institute work is the final answer on everything. They tell you of things they tested that didn't work. All that means is the way they tested it didn't work. It doesn't mean that it can't work at all. It might work in an alternative way. But it's the kind, when I talk about we need more communications research, it's the kind of work that Frameworks Institute does. Let me give you a concrete example of what Frameworks has done for a colleague of mine at Harvard who runs a Center on the Developing Child. They came up with a term that everybody's using, don't know where it came from, toxic stress. Jack Shonkoff, after chairing the National Academy of Sciences panel on the science of early childhood development, and started to work with governors and states and talking to them about the stress children face. Like, kids face stress. I face stress too. I mean, the kids face stress is no big deal because I face stress. Everybody does. And so he worked with Frameworks Institute. How do we talk about this? And they came up with the term toxic stress. You don't even have to explain it. When you say toxic stress, it conveys, the very language conveys this is something out of the ordinary. This is not the normal, everyday stress you face. So that's an example of what I mean when I say we need communication research that helps us to how you tell the story. Research by psychologists shows changing two words, the same facts, changing 2 words in how we describe it can build an emotional connection, whereas the first version didn't. So we actually need to identify the very language that we would use, because some of the dominant frameworks that people have, the language we use doesn't break through. So it's a whole area of work we need to do. Anyway, thank you for your questions. This has been great.
I want to thank you so much for the questions and for that amazing talk. I want to invite you to stick around for our faculty